25 men, one woman, and just 24 hours to prove herself, not to the people, not to the Senate, not even to the gods, but to something far more primal, her own hunger, and the echoing hollowness beneath Rome's marble foundations, in the shadowed heart of ancient Rome, where stone streets soaked up blood and gossip alike, a storm was gathering. Inside a smoke-drenched cell in the Subura, the district whispered about by senators and slavers, visited by soldiers and drunkards, an empress prepared to become legend. She wasn't born for scandal. She was bred for it. Valyria Messalina, child of aristocracy, descendant of emperors, married off at 15 to a man 3 decades older, Claudius, Rome's crippled uncle, a figure of ridicule to his own bloodline. They said he drooled in public, that he shook and stammered like a boy facing execution, that he was no threat to anyone, which made him perfect for the throne. And so, when Caligula's reign of blood finally ended, not in politics, but in blades, the Senate scrambled for a survivor, someone controllable. They found Claudius hiding behind a curtain, trembling, pathetic. The perfect puppet, only no one noticed the girl beside him. At just 18, Valyria Messalina became the most powerful woman in the world, and she was bored to death, to the world. She was beautiful, pristine, pale skin like ivory, hair black as obsidian, eyes that didn't just look, they calculated. People said she could silence a room with her stare, but behind those eyes was a woman caged by marble walls and ceremonial dresses, by a title that gave her everything but agency. So at night, she changed. Gone were the jewels and golden sandals. In their place, a wig of flaxen hair, simple robes, and the alias Lisa, meaning shadow. She slipped into the streets like smoke, past guards who turned their eyes away, past servants who feared what they might see, and into the Subura, Rome's rotten underbelly, a world of flesh and sweat, of low moans and heavy coin. Where masks weren't worn, they were stripped off, but she wasn't there to watch. She was there to serve, according to Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny, names scrawled across dusty scrolls. Barely a generation after her death, Messalina paid for a brothel cell with her own money. She didn't just walk among prostitutes, she became one, and she was unstoppable. Clients came and went, none aware they were touching the flesh of Rome's empress. Sometimes she charged, other times she didn't. It wasn't about the money. It never was. This was about power, the raw kind. The kind she never tasted in the palace halls, surrounded by sycophants and empty ceremony. Here in the stink of sweat and sex, she chose. She chose the name. She chose the rules. She chose the men, and sometimes she chose none, but it wasn't enough. As her hunger grew, so did her audacity. The palace became a theater of excess. Nighttime orgies masked as intimate dinners. Senators arrived in robes, left in shame. Wives were offered like wine. Declining an invitation meant political suicide. And Messalina watched it all with a silent smile. The smile of a woman who had flipped Rome's hierarchy on its back and made it beg. The rumors spread like fire, whispered in bathhouses, scribbled in graffiti, murmured behind fans at imperial banquets. She's not an empress. She's a beast. She's not human. No woman can be that hungry, but no one dared stop her. Not yet, not until that night, the night when everything changed. Men, one courtesan, one empress, and one unthinkable challenge. Before sunrise, Rome would be different, and Valyria Messalina would never be the same again. The torchlight flickered low in the Subura that night. Rome's underbelly, already a cesspit of secrets, held its breath. Word travelled fast. A whisper here, a smirk there, until the brothel was surrounded by murmurs and shadows. A challenge had been issued, but not just any challenge. The Empress herself, masked by her wig and alias, had stepped into the arena of desire and thrown down the gauntlet. Across the tiled floor, on a low platform slick with oil and wine, stood Sulla, Rome's most famous courtesan. She was no stranger to power. Senators left their homes for her. Generals gifted her villas for a night in her arms. She had seen everything Rome had to offer, but even she flinched when she realized who stood across from her, Messalina. No one called her that here, of course. She was Lisa, shadow in the dark, anonymous and deadly. Yet everyone knew, even if they pretended not to. Their eyes met. There were no greetings, no ceremony, just a nod, and the rules were set. Who could take the most men before dawn? This wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't even about lust. It was war. A war of bodies, stamina, pride, and identity. The Empress of Rome versus the Queen of the Streets. The first man stepped forward, young, nervous, chosen at random. His eyes flicked between the two women like a child forced to pick between gods. Sulla smiled first, laying back with elegance learned through years of calculated seduction. Her performance began like a dance, slow and deliberate. Messalina didn't bother with performance. She devoured him, and that was only the beginning. By the fifth man, Sulla was breathing hard, sweat beading on her brow. By the eighth, she was stalling between partners, demanding wine, asking for fans. The crowd, previously buzzing with arousal, turned quiet, confused. Even they began to feel something darker in the room. Messalina wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was accelerating. Number 10, number 11, number 12. The men kept coming. Soldiers, dock workers, stable boys, a few aristocrats wearing hoods. Some were pulled in from the street, promised coin. Others came from curiosity. Now turned participants in the most infamous sexual display in Roman memory. Sulla gave up somewhere after her 14th. Her body collapsed. Her attendants carried her out. No shame, no defeat, just shock. But Messalina, she kept going. 17, 18, 20. The walls of the brothel seemed to press inward. The other prostitutes stopped working. Patrons forgot their own desires. They stood outside the cell, her cell, listening to the rhythmic creaking of the bed, the low grunts, the sighs, the silence between partners. And then came the 25th, a slave from Numidia. Broad shoulders, dark eyes, trembling with disbelief. He entered the room not as a man, but as a question. Why? Why would a woman of power, of beauty, of position do this? Messalina met his gaze with cold, unblinking eyes. Not of exhaustion, not of shame, but of something ancient, something bottomless. Close the door, she whispered. When he stepped out, hours later, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They parted, letting him pass like a ghost. Inside, Messalina lay back on the stained sheets. Her body marked, her breathing shallow. She was pale, still, but her eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling as if she could see the stars above the stone. The Empress had won. But what had she proven? Word reached the palace by morning, not through messengers, through rumor, faster than horses, more cutting than blades. By midday, the tale was in the Senate. By nightfall, it was carved into walls, whispered by priests, muttered in bathhouses by naked nobles too afraid to laugh aloud. Claudius said nothing, or he didn't believe it, or perhaps he knew all along. But for Messalina, something had changed. She had reached a point of no return, not because of what she did, but because now everyone knew, and Rome never forgot a woman who stepped out of line, especially one who enjoyed it. The sun rose over Rome like a golden dagger, slicing through the fog that clung to its temples and alleys. But in the corridors of the palace, that sunlight brought no warmth, only clarity. The kind that leaves no room for denial. The whispers had become thunder, 25 in one night. She didn't stop even when Sulla collapsed. She smiled through the 20th, laughed through the 23rd. She's not a woman. She's possessed. Inside the imperial palace, marble floors gleamed, servants bowed low, and schedules were maintained with military precision. Officially, everything functioned as normal. But behind closed doors, the empire's most powerful men gathered in hushed meetings, brows furrowed, wine untouched. Narcissus was the first to speak it aloud. She's no longer just a scandal. She's a threat. A former slave turned imperial secretary, Narcissus had outlived emperors. He understood Rome's fragility, Messalina's descent into madness, or worse, self-directed rebellion, was no longer gossip to be ignored. It was ammunition, and it could tear the empire in half. Across from him, Pallas, another freedman with the emperor's ear, nodded slowly. His face was carved in stone. We wait too long, and she owns the Senate, because she already owned the men, senators, generals, merchants, not through force, but through shame. Everyone who'd attended her parties, those nights of orgiastic power plays, had something to lose. And Messalina had kept the names. She didn't blackmail them. She didn't need to. Their silence was guaranteed by fear. Claudius, meanwhile, remained disturbingly passive. Whether blinded by love, by delusion, or by his own deep-rooted insecurities, no one knew, but he was not acting. And that inaction was costing Rome dearly. Messalina, they realized, was building something. And it wasn't a secret anymore. By now, every corner of the empire had heard the tale. Even in Gaul, soldiers joked of the Empress of Endurance. In Alexandria, scholars debated whether such physical exertion was possible. In Antioch, prostitutes adopted the name Lisa to increase their business. The legend was alive, but legends had a cost. For Messalina, the aftermath of the contest was quiet. She didn't gloat. She didn't parade. She returned to her palace chamber and bathed for hours. Rose petals in the water. No servants allowed. Just her and the silence. But her mind was not still. She watched the ripples in the water, lips slightly parted, chest rising and falling with a rhythm slower than sleep. Some say she muttered names of the men from that night. Others say she wept, but none dared ask. Only Lepida, her estranged mother, noticed the change. That week, she visited the palace unannounced. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Messalina had denounced Lepida's allies in the Senate. But blood finds blood, even when it's drowned in shame. I don't care what they say, Lepida whispered, her voice brittle. I care what you become. Messalina turned slowly, drying her hands. Her face was unreadable. I became what I had to, she replied. What Rome made me. Outside the palace, the wheels of retribution were already turning. Narcissus had begun collecting testimonies. Quietly, carefully, slaves, attendants, musicians from the orgies, even a drunken senator or two, men whose tongues loosened too easily under wine. Every word they uttered was recorded, sealed, saved. They weren't just building a case, they were building a future without her. And then came a twist no one saw. Coming, Messalina didn't slow down. If anything, her actions intensified. More parties, more lovers, more rumors. And behind each one, an unspoken dare. Do something she was no longer hiding. Not her desire, not her defiance, not her domination of Roman masculinity itself. It was political suicide, or political genius. No one could tell the difference anymore. And in the center of it all, Claudius, emperor, father, husband, a man whose every instinct told him to ignore, to retreat, to let the storm pass. But storms didn't pass. They broke. One night, Messalina stood on her private balcony. The city stretched before her like a painting. The moon touched the rooftops. Far below, a street musician played a flute. She closed her eyes and listened. A servant approached timidly. My lady, there are reports. The secretary's there, gathering things. Messalina didn't flinch. I know. The servant hesitated. Should we act? Messalina opened her eyes. No, she said. Let them try, because in her mind she was untouchable. In the minds of Rome's most dangerous men, she was already dead. Love was never part of her plans. Desire, yes. Power, yes. Control, always. But love? That emotion was for foolish girls and poets drunk on their own fantasies. Yet it came anyway, quietly, like a knife slipping beneath armor. His name was Gaius Silius, handsome in a way Rome rarely produced anymore. Not the delicate marble beauty of statues, but a living, breathing kind. Strong jaw, broad shoulders, intelligent eyes that didn't tremble in her presence. A senator young enough to be sought after, old enough to understand danger. He was exactly the sort of man the Empress was never supposed to want, and he wasn't afraid of her. That alone made him lethal. Their first meeting wasn't romantic, it was political. He had come to petition for support in a land dispute. The palace attendants lowered their eyes. Slaves moved silently along the walls, and Messalina walked in like a storm, disguised as a woman. She watched him as he spoke, not his petition. Him, the boldness in his voice, the steadiness in his manner. He never stuttered, never flinched. He looked at her not as empress or myth, but as a person. No fear, no awe, just recognition. It was the first time in years that someone wasn't bending beneath her shadow. That night, she could not erase his face from her mind. At first, she convinced herself it was lust. Just another appetite. She'd tasted hundreds of bodies and forgotten them before morning. Why should his be different? But every time she closed her eyes, it wasn't the memory of flesh she saw. It was the look in his eyes, not hunger, not submission, understanding days. Later she summoned him again, officially for further discussion of his petition. Everyone in the palace understood what that meant. But when he entered her private chamber, he didn't touch her. He waited. "You came," she said softly. "You called," he replied. 1,000 men had dropped to their knees for her. Silius did not move. 1,000 men had craved her body. Silius wanted her soul, or at least the pieces Rome had not yet consumed. When she finally kissed him, it wasn't conquest, it was surrender that terrified her more than anything she'd done in the Subura, because lust was something she commanded. But love made her human, and humanity was a weakness Rome devoured. The affair ignited like dry oil on a torch. She found excuses to see him. Longer audiences, private banquets, fabricated legal matters. Soon it wasn't her sneaking out to the brothel anymore. It was her sneaking into his villa, a place without court politics, without guards listening, without the throne between them, with Silius. She wasn't empress, she wasn't predator or spectacle or myth, she was just Messalina. That was the most dangerous transformation of all, because love blurred the line between fantasy and reality just enough that she began to believe. She could rewrite the world, not as thirsty legend, not as feared mistress of Rome, but as wife, chosen freely for the first time in her life. That belief that she could love publicly as she did privately was the spark that lit her downfall. It started with a question, a single sentence spoken in a whisper against her throat, as they lay tangled in silk one afternoon. Why not make it real? No Roman woman would have dared imagine such a thing, but Messalina wasn't a Roman woman. She was wildfire wearing a crown, and for the first time she wanted more than power. She wanted freedom. That desire, not lust, not scandal, led her to the most reckless decision of her life, because love, unlike appetite, demands sacrifice, and Rome was about to demand hers. It was a wedding Rome was never supposed to witness, not because it was illegal, though it was, not because it was outrageous, though it surpassed even the wildest rumors of the Subura, but because it was public, and Messalina didn't hide. She wore the bridal veil, flammeum, bright orange like fire licking the sky. She stood barefoot on the grass in her own gardens, surrounded by cypress trees and trellises hung with roses. She laughed, truly laughed, for the first time since girlhood, and beside her, in full ceremonial robes, stood Gaius Silius, the most handsome man in Rome, smiling like a boy who had won the gods' favor. But the gods weren't watching. The Senate was. The servants were. So were Rome's elite, invited, bribed or threatened into attendance. Senators, generals, noblewomen. Many arrived shaking, unsure whether to call it a coup or a joke. No one knew what to say. Was it real? Was it theater? Was the empress divorced? Because her husband, Claudius, the emperor, was still very much alive. He was away at Ostia, inspecting grain shipments, old, tired, oblivious, but even a fool cannot ignore a fire once it reaches the palace gates. Some sources say Messalina had a plan. that the wedding was a calculated act of political replacement, crown Silius, install herself as queen beside him, and eliminate the emperor in absentia. Others say it was madness, that years of indulgence, unchecked power, and suppressed desires had snapped her grip on reality. What is certain is this: she married Silius, publicly, with witnesses, with vows, with music and feasting, as if she wasn't already married to the Emperor of Rome, and worse, she seemed to believe she could get away with it. Tacitus records, the ceremony was lavish. The gardens were decorated with drapes and perfumed fountains. Musicians played lyres and flutes. Guests were forced to drink and smile as if they weren't participating in treason. Some said she was drunk on love. Others whispered darker things, that she wanted Claudius to find out, that she dared him to react, that she was tired of hiding, of pretending, of being two women in one skin. For 7 years she had lived in 2 worlds. Now she wanted only one, but Rome wasn't ready to give it. Word reached Claudius in whispers at first. Disbelief protected him for a day or two, until Narcissus stepped in, the ever-watchful secretary who had documented every scandal, every late-night disappearance, every witness statement about her brothel escapades. He arrived in Ostia with letters, documents, witnesses, even a painting, drawn in secret by a terrified slave, depicting the wedding scene with unmistakable faces. Claudius still didn't speak. He dropped the letters. He stared into space. Then, slowly he asked the question, "Is it true?" Narcissus didn't answer. He didn't need to. What followed wasn't grief. It was movement. The Praetorian Guard was summoned. Orders were barked. Riders dispatched. Rome held its breath as the gears of power shifted back into place. Not slowly, not carefully, with violence. Silius was arrested first. He didn't resist. No pleas, no denials. Only a single request: kill me quickly. He was executed the same day, beheaded in silence, his body burned, his name erased from all records. Messalina was still in her garden. The music had stopped. The guests had vanished. Only silence remained, and it pressed in like a shroud. She tried to act quickly. She gathered her 2 children, Britannicus and Octavia, and tried to reach Claudius, hoping their presence might soften his fury. But Narcissus was faster. He intercepted her, and unlike the emperor, he had no mercy. "Go to her," he told the tribune. "End it. Now." Messalina didn't cry. Not yet. She fled to the gardens of Lucullus, a luxurious estate she had seized years earlier through political manipulation and false accusations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The place she had stolen became her prison. The gardens were silent. Once, they had pulsed with music and laughter, the echo of flirtations beneath silk canopies, the clink of goblets overflowing with sweet wine. Senators had stumbled through the hedges drunk on pleasure and fear. Generals had whispered allegiance under moonlight. The gardens of Lucullus had been her playground, her courtroom, her throne away from the marble prison of the palace. Now, only wind moved, the fountains were dry, the flowers wilted, and at the center of it all sat Valyria Messalina, barefoot, pale, trembling slightly in the early autumn air. No crown, no veil. No lovers, just her mother. Lepida had not been present for much of Messalina's rise. They had fought, separated by pride and politics. But mothers are strange creatures. They appear at the end when no one else does. Now she sat beside her daughter, watching the fading empress stare blankly into the sky. "She won't do it," one of the guards whispered near the gate. "She must," said the tribune. "She knows what's coming." A dagger had been placed before her, not out of kindness but expectation. Roman nobility was expected to die with dignity. Suicide was not shameful. It was tradition. A final act of control. Messalina picked it up. The blade was cold, sharp, unused. She held it in her lap like a toy she didn't understand. Lepida leaned in, voice low and urgent. "Do it, my daughter. Don't let them disgrace you. Die like an empress, not like this." But her hands wouldn't move. For years they had signed executions, ordered silences, stripped others of dignity without pause. Those hands had touched hundreds of men, ruled rooms with a gesture, pointed to lives and decided fates. Now they trembled. Useless. She couldn't lift the blade. She couldn't die. Not alone. Not like this. Narcissus had been right to intervene. Claudius, had he seen her, barefoot, weeping, flanked by her children, might have forgiven. He had forgiven worse before. But this time, the secretary took no risks. The tribune and the centurion had their orders. No audience. No delay. Messalina was still struggling with the dagger when they approached. Her eyes flicked to them wide, pleading, not for mercy but for time. Just a little more. Just another minute to breathe, to speak, to explain. But the tribune didn't pause. His patience was gone. Rome had waited long enough. He stepped forward. The blade flashed once. Lepida screamed. Not a noble wail, but a mother's scream, raw and human. The kind that doesn't echo because it never stops. Messalina's body dropped silently to the marble. No final words, no epic monologue, no dignity, just blood on stone. She died at 22, an empress, a mother, a legend, and a woman no one truly understood. Lepida remained by her side, brushing the hair from her daughter's face, closing the eyes that had once paralyzed half the Senate with a glance. She whispered something then, something history didn't record, and then she, too, vanished. No records speak of her after that day. Back in the palace, Claudius was dining when the news arrived. She is dead, Narcissus announced simply. Suetonius claims the emperor said nothing. He kept eating, drank more wine, asked for olives. Whether this was coldness, shock, or sheer emotional collapse, no one could tell. He never mentioned her name again. No state funeral. No procession. No mourning period. She was erased. The palace was scrubbed of her likeness. Her statues destroyed. Her name removed from official records. Even her children, Britannicus and Octavia, were rebranded politically. Their ties to their mother minimized. But Rome remembered. Rome always remembers. And in the Subura, the tale of the empress, who had once competed with prostitutes and won, only grew, exaggerated, inflamed, immortalized. They called her names: harlot, monster, she-wolf of the empire. But beneath the slander was a deeper truth no one dared say aloud. She had terrified them, not for her lust, but for her freedom. The storm had passed. Or so it seemed. Messalina's body was buried in silence. No state honors, no mourning banners, not even a grave with her name. It was said the dirt swallowed her as Rome exhaled, relieved, scandal-sick, and desperate to pretend none of it ever happened. But blood does not disappear that easily. In the days after her death, the palace grew eerily quiet. No music, no laughter. Servants moved like ghosts. Senators walked the halls with lowered eyes. For 7 years she had been everywhere, in their beds, at their tables, in their nightmares. And now she was gone, but her fingerprints were not. They lingered in the terrified eyes of aristocrats who had danced at her. Wedding to Silius, in the stained reputation of generals who had once pleasured her at her garden. Feasts, in the choking guilt of a senate that had watched her rise and fall, but never once stopped her. Claudius moved on quickly. Within months, he married again, Agrippina the Younger, niece of the emperor and mother to a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. History would come to know that boy as Nero. It was no accident Agrippina was chosen. She was cold, calculating. She'd seen what unchecked female power could do. She didn't want to be like Messalina, wild, public, untamable. She wanted to rule through stealth, manipulation, and the weapon Rome feared most, a mother's ambition. She moved swiftly. First, she had Messalina's son, Britannicus, pushed aside. Claudius was easily convinced that Nero should be adopted as his heir. He obeyed. He always obeyed. Messalina's daughter, Octavia, was married to Nero, a symbolic insult. One final twist in the empire's cruelty. The daughter of the most Disgraced woman in Rome, bound in marriage to the boy, meant to erase her. Bloodline Octavia would live a miserable life. Britannicus wouldn't live long at all. The time he reached adolescence, Nero, guided by his mother, saw him as a threat. Too popular, too noble, too Messalina. And so one night Britannicus took a sip of wine at a banquet and never spoke. Again, poison, just like his mother had once ordered for others. Now, it returned as if Rome itself had inhaled her sins and exhaled them back onto her children. Octavia would later be exiled, then executed. Her crime? Existing in Nero's orbit. Being a reminder of Messalina's blood, her skull was sent back to the palace wrapped in linen, and so the line ended. But her enemies? They thrived. Narcissus, the man who orchestrated her death, remained powerful for a time, until Agrippina saw him as a threat too. He was forced to commit suicide not long after, a quiet death fitting for the man who once silenced a queen. Pallas followed a similar fate. Replaced, discarded, forgotten, each of them had helped slay the serpent, only to be bitten themselves later. As for Claudius, some say he never recovered. Outwardly he ruled for a few more years, signed edicts, attended rituals, laughed at jokes he didn't understand. But those closest to him whispered of a change, something hollowed out after Messalina's death. Some say he missed her. Others say he feared her ghost more than he ever feared her presence. When he died, poisoned, likely by Agrippina, no one wept. Nero became emperor, and Rome learned what true madness looked like. The city that once condemned Messalina for excess would soon be ruled by a man who killed his own mother, set fire to the capital, and played music while people burned alive. Suddenly, a woman sleeping with 25 men in a brothel didn't seem so outrageous. In fact, some whispered she had been ahead of her time. But Rome wouldn't allow that thought to spread, so it turned her into a myth. The cautionary tale. The wicked empress. The whore with a crown. Her name became a warning, not to men, but to women. This is what happens when a woman wants too much. History remembers her as a monster, a nymphomaniac, a seductress, a she-wolf who corrupted Rome from within. But history, as always, was written by the survivors. And the survivors needed a villain. Valyria Messalina, Empress of Rome, didn't leave behind letters, diaries, or proclamations. Not a single word in her own hand. All we have are the words of men: Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, Juvenal. Writers with agendas, historians with patrons, moralists with fantasies, and they all agreed on one thing: she was too much, too beautiful, too sexual, too shameless, too free, and in ancient Rome that was a death sentence. But what if it wasn't madness? What if it wasn't addiction, hysteria, or some ancient diagnosis of a wandering womb? What if she knew exactly what she was doing? Married at 15 to a man 3 times her age, a man mocked by his own guards, dismissed by his family, whispered about in the baths. Messalina was never meant to have a voice. She was supposed to birth heirs, smile at banquets, and vanish behind palace curtains. Instead, she carved out a kind of power Rome had no name for. She didn't wield swords. She didn't command legions. She commanded attention. She bent senators with secrets. She tamed generals with shame. She turned the bedroom into a battlefield, and she won, and that terrified Rome more than war, because men like Caligula could rape and murder their own sisters and still be called emperors. Tiberius could keep child sex slaves on islands. Nero could light the city on fire and laugh. But Messalina slept with 25 men in a brothel, and the empire never recovered. Why? Because a woman enjoying her own desire, not hidden, not ashamed, but open, was more dangerous than a tyrant with a sword. Because her body was supposed to belong to the state, to her husband, to the Senate's expectations, and she said no. She said mine, and that's the real scandal. It wasn't the contest. It wasn't the wedding. It wasn't the orgies or the disguises or the whisper that she could have staged a coup. It was the simple, unbearable truth that a woman born into chains, who figured out how to rattle the empire without ever raising her voice. And when they killed her, quickly, quietly, in that stolen garden, they weren't punishing crimes. They were bearing a warning to every woman after her. Don't be loud. Don't be visible. Don't be free, or we will make your name a curse for 2,000 years. And they did, but still her legend survives, whispered in red light districts, studied in feminist lectures, mocked by men who fear what they cannot control. They turned her into a cautionary tale. But perhaps Messalina was something far more dangerous than an empress, or a scandal, or a symbol of shame. Perhaps she was the first Roman woman who looked power in the face and claimed it for herself, not through war, not through men, but through choice, and that is what Rome could never forgive.